Let's go, here are the threats. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are. Knight takes pawn, check. Queen to e5, check. Queen to e4, check. Queen to e3, check. Queen to f2, check. Queen to d3, check. Queen to d2, check. Queen to d1, check. Queen to b2, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is Queen to b2, check. King to e1. Knight to c5. Queen to c7, check. King to f6. Rook to d1. Queen takes bishop. One more, the threats are Queen takes queen. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to d7, check. Queen to e7, check. Queen to f7, check. Queen to g8, check. The puzzle is solved using rook to c1. Queen takes pawn, check. King to h1. Queen to g7. Bishop to e5. Next, the threats are bishop takes pawn. The checks are b5, check. Bishop to b5, check. Answer to this puzzle is h4. Pawn takes pawn. Bishop to e4. Bishop takes bishop. King takes bishop. King to b5. King takes pawn. King takes pawn. King to g5. King takes pawn. f4. b5. f5. b4. Pawn takes pawn. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are. There are no threats in this position. Checks in this position are. Queen to c6, check. The answer is Queen to c6, check. Rook to g2. Rook to g4. Knight to g3. Rook to f2. Knight to e4. Rook takes rook. Next puzzle, the threats are. Bishop takes pawn, check. Knight takes knight. Bishop takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes knight. Checks in puzzle position are. Bishop takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The answer is rook takes knight. Bishop takes rook. Knight takes bishop. Knight takes bishop. Knight to f5. f6. Rook to e7. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is King to d5. King to c7. b4. Pawn takes pawn. King to c4. One more, here are the threats. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes rook, check. Checks in this position are. Rook takes rook, check. Solution to the puzzle is rook to h2. Bishop to h4. Pawn takes pawn. g5. Knight to e4. Another puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are. Bishop takes knight. Rook takes knight. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes bishop. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using f5. Rook takes knight. Queen takes rook. Next puzzle. Threats in this position are. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to c8, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to f7, check. Queen to g8, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The best move in puzzle position is pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Bishop to f4. Rook to d8. Bishop takes pawn, check. Rook takes bishop. Queen takes rook, check. King to g8. Queen to e6, check. Next, threats in puzzle position are. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen to f5, check. Queen to c1, check. Queen to e4, check. Queen takes pawn, check. c2, check. The puzzle is solved using c2, check. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Pawn takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. King to c1. Queen takes rook, check. Let us go to the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes bishop. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes rook. Checks in puzzle position are. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook to d1, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes rook. King takes rook. Rook to d5. Queen to b7. Queen to e4. Another one. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. King takes knight. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Promotes to queen, check. Promotes to bishop, check. The puzzle is solved using. King takes knight. King takes pawn. King to e6. King to d2. King to d6. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in this position are. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are. Queen to f5, check. Queen to f4, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The answer is. Queen to f4, check. King to h5. Queen to f7, check. Queen takes queen, check. King takes queen. King to g4. King to g6. f4. Pawn takes pawn. King takes pawn. King to h5. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Pawn takes knight. Pawn takes bishop. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. Pawn takes bishop. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is. Pawn takes bishop. Bishop takes rook. Bishop takes knight, check. Pawn takes bishop. Queen takes pawn, check. King to f8. b7, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes rook, check. Another puzzle. Here are the threats. Rook takes knight, check. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook takes knight, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook, check. Queen to e4, check. The puzzle is solved using. Queen to g4. Queen to f2. Rook to e6. Rook to h4. Queen takes knight. Rook takes queen. Rook takes rook. Another puzzle. The threats are. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight. Knight takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are. Queen takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using. Bishop to c6. Bishop to e4. Knight to c3. Queen to g2. Knight takes bishop. Another puzzle. Threats in this position are. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to g4, check. Bishop to f3, check. Bishop to b3, check. The answer is. Rook to b8. Queen to a6. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes knight, check. Bishop takes bishop. Let's see the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop to f6. Knight takes bishop. Pawn takes knight. King to f8. Queen to h2. King to e8. Knight to e5. Queen to g2, check. Queen takes queen. Bishop takes queen. King takes bishop. Next, here are the threats. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn, check. King takes knight. Checks in puzzle position are. Bishop takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using. Rook to c1. Queen to f3, check. King takes knight. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The answer is. f5. King to f3. Pawn takes pawn, check. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are. Pawn takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes queen. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is. f6. h6. Pawn takes pawn. King takes pawn. Bishop to e3. Bishop takes knight. Bishop takes pawn, check. King to h7. Queen to g5. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. Queen to h5. Let us go to the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook. Queen takes pawn. The checks are: rook takes pawn, check. Queen to h2, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The answer is: rook takes pawn, check. King takes rook. Queen to f3, check. King to g1. Rook to d8. Next puzzle, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes bishop. Knight takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is d7. Rook to d3. Knight takes pawn. Rook to d4. Rook to c6. One more. Here are the threats. Queen takes pawn, check. Checks in puzzle position are: knight to c3, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using knight to c3, check. Pawn takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. King to b5. a6, check. King to c4. Queen to a4, check. Next puzzle, here are the threats. Rook takes bishop. Knight takes bishop. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Queen to h1, check. Queen to g1, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is: Queen to h1, check. King to e2. Knight takes bishop, check. Queen takes knight. Queen takes rook, check. King takes queen. Rook takes queen. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.